Hello, everybody. My name is Oliver Ortega, and I'm here with the poet Jacob Saenz. He's here for an event that we're hosting, a poetry reading hosted by Letras Latinas, which is part of the Institute of Latino Studies. Letras Latinas is the literary arm of the Latino Studies Institute, and today we are honored to have Jacob as our guest here. So Jacob's first collection of poetry is called Throwing the Crown. It was published in 2018, and it was the winner of the APR Hockman First Book Prize. Jacob is also a Canto Mundo Fellow, whose work has appeared in Pinwheel, Poetry, Tammy, Tri-Quarterly, and other journals. He's also been the recipient of a Letras Latina residency, as well as a Ruth Lilly Poetry Fellowship. Currently, he's associate editor for Rhino, and he also works at Columbia College in Chicago. Well, Jacob, thank you so much for being here. We're sort of following up on the conversation we had earlier today when Jacob attended a course that I'm teaching called Multi-Ethnic Literatures of Chicago, in which he spoke about poems that are part of this collection, and also a little bit about his craft and his view of poetry within society as a whole. I think today, for the sake of our viewers and of our collection, right, because this is part of an interview series, maybe we'll kind of just open broadly by asking you, what was the process like for you to produce this collection, and maybe how has your craft evolved since the time you came out with this book?
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here and being a part of this project. So for me, the book actually began through Letras Latinas and through a residency that I was fortunate enough to be a part of at the Anderson Center for the Arts in Red Wing, Minnesota. And I was awarded the 2011 fellowship there for the Latino artists in residence, and it was a month-long residency where I worked on some poems. Not many poems, but enough writing to sort of get things going. But really my main project and purpose there was to get the idea of the book going. So that, like I said, that was in 2011 and the book was published in 2018. So the book, it's been a 7-year process, but it began there. That's when I initially started to put the book together, lay the poems out on the floor and sort of pull them together into to see if any sort of like cohesive form and order. One of the beautiful things, it was a really beautiful center, the Anderson Center for the Arts, and one of the beautiful things that they have there, they have this like water tower that's just an abandoned water tower, and we were able to access like the top floor of it. And another poet who was residence there, Sarah Fox, she ended up like taking up the majority of the residency in the tower, but I was able to go up there at times when she wasn't occupying it, and that's where I sort of like laid down all the poems and started like thinking of the poems I had at the time and like what they look like in a book form. And I had maybe 40 to 50 pages of poetry that I felt good enough at the time that I could build off of that. And so throughout the course of those 7 years since the inception of its publication, the book has changed a lot. I think initially I had it in one whole section, or no breaks between poems, whereas now it's in 3 sections. I also, I guess it just changed a lot. Some poems that initially were laid out on the floor are no longer a part of the book. They got cut with other poems because I was sort of writing newer poems, and that felt the arc of the book, which is just sort of the evolution of myself, or the speaker of myself as a person. And as far as the question of how my practice has changed, or
Yeah, how has it changed in this publication?
It's, I would love to do another residency there or somewhere else. I feel like I work full-time at a library, as you mentioned, the Columbia College Chicago Library, and it's a good job. It's like a sort of typical 9-to-5 job. with a lot. Obviously, I got the evenings and weekends off, and it's very nice. And that's where I tend to do most of my writing, especially the weekend mornings. But I feel like the poems that I'm working on now, or at least since the book has been out, has they've sort of been on treading the same grounds. You know, like a lot of family poems, a lot of sort of childhood based poems, which are themes that I explored in this book. But I'm sort of building off of it, and I don't know. I've also been, experienced some loss the past couple of years within my family, and so that has informed my writing. Grief and mourning is a part of the process now, and I lost, three tias within the span of like 6 months, and that was pretty hard, and because it was just back to back to back, and so I'm still sort of processing it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to sort of go and like properly mourn and grieve with our family down in Texas, but was able to sort of watch via live stream. And so, anyways, the poems. I've been writing about that experience, like what that experience is like. It's a very sort of common experience now, 2 years into this pandemic, right? But I think, it's still a process that I'm trying to learn from.
Absolutely. So one of the themes of the class that we're teaching, and of which you are sort of the crowning part, in the sense that you're a contemporary writer, right? And your connection is so fresh, and you're so timely. I'm wondering a little bit about how traveling away from Chicago, Cicero area, was that something you had to do in order to write about Chicago and Cicero in your poetry? And then also sort of the connection that you have to other places as well, right? The way in which Chicago is sort of a place of migration, a hub of movement, and how the sense of that in your own life has also informed the way you write poetry.
Yeah, I think, my family is from Texas, Harlingen area, near the San Benito Valley area, and they eventually migrated up, some towards Chicago, some towards Colorado. And so that's a part of the process, of course, is into writing. But I think for me, at least going to the Red Wing Anderson, the Anderson Center for the Arts, that was a really cool experience because, I've known, urban life all my life, right? It's like Cicero and Chicago. Those are like the two things that I know most. And so going to Red Wing, Minnesota, and being exposed to different types of trees that I hadn't really seen, or different types of birds that I'm not normally seeing in the city, as well as just being in more sort of, open country area, was really informative and really helped me in my writing. I ended up writing some poems about my time there, specifically with like the nature aspects of it. But yeah, I was obviously also working on these poems that I had built up to that point about growing up in Cicero or in Chicago, and how that factored into my writing. I think it was I think the purpose of residencies are to sort of get you out of your element and get you out of your sort of habitual space, to sort of see if it can trigger some new writing or some new ways of thinking and viewing the world. And I think it's a very helpful experience, and I encourage anyone to apply for residency, specifically at the Anderson Center. They had, because it wasn't just, of course, poets. There were musicians there was artists. They had a glass blowing studio on site. So it was really cool to connect with the people there, like, and see their process, and try to incorporate maybe some of what they do into my own practice.
You've mentioned music a couple of times. I wondered what sort of affinity or connection do you see between music and poetry? Is that something that you think about in your own craft? Maybe the way, because I think in your work, at least I find there's a certain musicality or rhythm that you seem to be pursuing. And I think it works really well for the poetic product that you're kind of giving. Is there anything you think about as far as that relationship with music?
Well, thanks for saying that. I think for sure music played a big role for me growing up, specifically like hip hop and rap music. I came of age during, the sort of gangster rap era. I had brothers one of my brothers is actually a DJ. He's a house DJ. And he has a great record collection and a great musical taste, as well as one of my older brothers too. They were both had great musical taste, and so I got to sort of check out the records that they have and the CDs that they had at the time, um, and I felt like that was, especially with hip hop, that was like a part of informing my writing process, because I started out writing a lot of, very rhymey poems that were just like really terrible. But I did write some raps back in the day and tried to, you know, I'm not a flower, I'm not a rapper, but I also felt like it was important for me to try to, get these verses down and then help to see how I can incorporate, these sort of rhythm patterns that I was learning at the time into my poetry. And so for me with the poetry, uh, the music of certain poems matters to me. I am interested in sound and the way, playing with alliteration and playing with assonance and consonants and not necessarily end rhymes, because that was like a big part of like my high school stuff, but more like internal rhymes or sort of, or slight rhymes. I try to incorporate that in my writings just to sort of give the flow to a piece that maybe that just felt like it needed some more movement. And so I do pay attention to that when as part of my process. I tend to read the poems out loud to myself and then hear what it sounds like and then sort of edit that way as I go. And I think a part of it is because of the music, specifically like the hip hop music I grew up listening to.
Is there a way, um, is there a difference between the way a poem exists on paper as something to be read internally, by yourself, silently, versus a poem that's performed? Is there something that's gained or lost in that process, or how do you approach that idea or the act of having to read a poem? Like, as far as you find yourself changing the poem, does the experience of the poem change when you read it out loud?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes I do sort of edit as I'm reading out loud. Maybe I'll omit a certain word, or it could just even be a mistake where I just forget to read a certain word or a couple words in a poem, just sort of glancing over it. I do think it's important for poetry to be read out loud. Initially, like when you're first encountering a poem, I would recommend reading a poem out loud to yourself, just to see the sonic quality, just to hear it, one, and then sort of going back and reading it to yourself quietly and meditating on what you just heard versus what you're sort of hearing in your mind. I do think it's important too to hear a poet read their own poems too, just so we all have our sort of our own sense of reading and rhythm, or rhythm when it comes to reading. But of course, the person who wrote the poem has their own idea of like, this is the way the poem should sort of sound out loud, and you'll hear maybe more deliberate pauses or breaks, an emphasis on the line breaks in certain poets than you would in maybe some of my own work, for example. I tend to sort of not rush through, but sometimes maybe I don't give the line breaks as much pause as they deserve at times. But it's something I think about a lot too, and because I do think that the sonic qualities can help pull people into poetry who might not otherwise be interested in poetry if they were to just see it stagnant on the page. If that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Maybe would you mind if we read a poem that you think exemplifies that sort of attention to the sonic quality? Is there a poem that you said, oh, like the musicality is important here for me in your collection?
Yeah. I can read The Evolution of My Block poem, because I think that poem specifically incorporated a lot of sort of rhythm and rhymes that I was sort of going for.
Sounds good.
Evolution of My Block. As a boy, I bicycled the block with a brown mop top falling into a tail bleached blonde, gold-like under golden light, like colors of noble knights, banging on corners, unconcerned with the colors I bore, a shorty too small to war with, too brown to be down for the block. White knights became brown kings, still showing black and gold on corners now crowned. The block a branch branded with La Corona graffitied on garage doors by the pawns. As a teen, I could have beamed the crown, walked in without the beat-down custom, warred with my cousin who claimed 2-6, the set on the next block, decked in black and beige. But I preferred games to gangs, books to crooks wearing hats crooked to the left or right, fighting for a plot, a block to spot and mark with blood, of boys who knew no better way to grow up than throw up the crown and be down for whatever.
Thank you so much. That was great. So here, this is a poem here that's pretty structured, right? You have the stanzas are all 3 lines. So I'm thinking about how is structure a part of your process, as far as like, do you set out to sort of fit a specific form? Does the subject matter dictate the form, and how did that sort of come through for evolution of my block?
Well, that poem was sort of born as like a prompt based off this reading series that I got to be a part of, and the theme of the reading or that night was like neighborhoods or won't you be my neighbor or something. And a friend of mine was, the curator of it and asked if I would read some poems. And at the time I was working on this poem and maybe other poems about my neighborhood. I mean, a lot of them are about my neighborhood, especially in the book. But so that particular poem, the Evolution on My Block, it's also sort of like in line with another poem, 2 other poems in the book, Evolution on My Skin and Evolution, blanking now on the other one, Evolution of My Profile. And those were all in tercets. And I was thinking about, for those poems specifically, the sound was important, like trying to get certain sonic qualities across, and having short lines, compact stanzas was important for me to try to get down. Because I felt like they were all, they were speaking to each other in different ways and about, the speaker's evolution of the self through these lenses, one through skin, one through the profile that maybe people project on you, and then the other obviously about the block growing up. And yeah, so I think for those specific poems, I wanted to try to get a very tight, compact form down. However, that's not always the form I'm like using. I do like quatrains a lot too, and I feel like that might be a fallback for me, like even like a first draft of a poem. Maybe I tend to gravitate towards like quatrains and having 4-line stanzas for whatever reason. And maybe I think it's something I need to break out of, because I feel like even though the poems may not be on the same sort of subject matter, I feel like the form is similar, so there's going to be a lot of familiarity, at least in terms of the look. But for other poems in the book, like for example, the Bachelor poems, right? Those are all 1 block text, no breaks, no stanza breaks. And I think for me, the way I approached the writing of those poems, it was more about, I kind of approached them as like comedic monologues or monologue type of works. Another brother of mine is an actor, and he studied, so he went to theater school, and growing up, I would help him with his monologues or help him with read his lines to help him get through a play. And I remember encountering like monologues in playbooks, and just being enthralled by like the form of it. And I wanted to try to mimic that within the poetic form of within the Bachelor series. And so the way I approached those was, like trying to just keep it, this is like the Bachelor's monologue for this specific moment about, warming a pizza or something, or taking out the trash. And I try to incorporate some humor in it, but, humor is very subjective, and not everyone is going to laugh with what I think is funny. And I think that's something that I've learned since writing these poems. I have this memory before of like reading these poems to a very small reading in Chicago, and I was testing out these poems, and I thought they were funny, but no one laughed, and it was just like dead silence, and I'm just like, it was only like 10 of us, less than 10 of us, and I just felt like I bombed, and I felt like I still kept going with the poems, obviously, and now they're in this book, and so things have worked out. And they do get some laughs now, depending on the crowd, I guess. But for this one particular reading, it was pretty cold reception. Um,
Let's talk a little bit about, so you've talked about tercets, use of quatrains as well. What about the sonnet? The sonnet appears here. You have a sonnet poem and then an anti-sonnet. How are you playing with the form of the sonnet in your collection?
well, I think I love the sonnet because, I mean, it's one of the oldest forms, and it's something that we're taught a lot in school. Of course, through the Shakespearean sonnets and Italian sonnets. But I think for me, the couple sonnets that I have in the book, they're like two essentially zombie sonnets, right? And so I'm talking about writing about zombies and in this playful manner. And I wanted to incorporate my love of zombies through this form. And again, this was partially born of a reading series and called Sonneteering. And I think at the time I was writing these zombie sonnets, so I thought it would be cool to share those. And the anti-sonnet is that's something that's actually sparked from a different poem, an anti-poet named Nicanor Parra. He's a Chilean poet, anti-poet, mathematician, and he has a great poem called Something Like That. And in that poem, he has there's a couple breaks, right? And there's one called Homework Assignment, and it just says compose a sonnet using this iambic pentameter first line. And I would prefer, to die ahead of you, or that, yeah. I'll read it just so I get it right. Yeah, the first line, I would prefer to die ahead of you. And then the final line was, I'd prefer that you be first to die. And so I saw that in that poem and I thought, oh wow, that'd be a cool challenge to try out. So I gave it my shot, and this is what I ended up coming up with. Anti-sonnet, after Nicanor Parra. I would prefer to die ahead of you and hope your heart burst apart, knowing deep down what your dick did, dicking around my mom and sticking her with a kid you didn't bother to father. Or just a fucker fucking around on your wife who was not my mom. Left with my body and bastardized blood, I would kill to spill, and so fill myself with drink and think you're dead. I think I'm drunk and hope you're sunk in a coffin, cut off from the air we share till death, and if not dead, the desire. I would prefer that you be first to die. It's what parents do. And so obviously I broke the sonnet rules that he had because I added another line, right? So it's not 14 lines, it's actually 15 lines. But if it's titled anti-sonnet, I thought, well, I gotta break away from it. And I just thought those are really compelling lines to sort of try to get, how do you get from point A to point B? And for me, the absent father in my life is always a big thing that's looming for me, and something I've been writing about since high school. So it felt good to sort of put that sort of energy and emotion that I was feeling at the time into this poem, into this tight, compact poem. And yeah, so that's that.
Yeah, of course. Why don't you tell us a little bit about growing up in Cicero? What was that like? And this is a collection with a significant biographical imprint, right? That's something you talked about. So just tell us a little bit about kind of growing up, what that was like, and what elements or what things from that time of your life sort of inspired poems in this collection.
Yeah, so I was born in Chicago and raised in Cicero, and my family was living, I think, in what's now considered West Town of Chicago at the time of my birth. And then shortly we moved to Cicero because one of my tias was living out in Cicero. I think they were living in a little village for a bit, and then eventually moved to Cicero, and we all sort of moved on the same block or very near each other, my mom and her sisters, as well as all my cousins. And And so, yeah, we came in the early 80s, I guess. And, I came of age in the 80s and the 90s. And so at the time, Cicero was, in the 80s at least, like a very predominantly white neighborhood, and it became a brown neighborhood. And then it transformed. There was always like gangs on the block, but it used to be this white gang, the Noble Knights, and then eventually they became the Latin Kings, or not them, but another gang sort of supplanted them. And so, growing up in that area, Grant Works in Cicero, which was like the factory side of town, and the more sort of ghetto side a little bit. Because I got to see the nicer part of Cicero for a bit because actually, so yeah, my K through fourth grade education was at Roosevelt School, which was like a block away from where we lived from. But then my fifth through eighth grade, we all got bused to different parts of Cicero, different schools in Cicero, and I went to Drexel School, which is in South Cicero, and that's like the nicer part, and like more homes, more bungalow style homes, as opposed to the apartment buildings that sort of occupied our block a lot. And so I got to see, the way certain people lived over there, and just to see the differences in the quality of like the houses and quality of life in general. And yeah, definitely on our side where we grew up, there was a lot more gang activity than I saw around in Drexel, especially once I hit high school. That junior year, junior high school age, I started hanging out with friends with our neighborhood that we all grew up with, and we started like ditching school a lot, smoking weed or playing games. But then some of them wanted to get involved with some gang stuff because we had some friends that were gangbangers, family members that were gangbangers. I have a cousin that was a gangbanger. And so that was a big part of always like around us. And so I learned early on, like I have to wear sort of certain colors in certain neighborhoods, or not to wear certain colors in certain neighborhoods, because this block is, a Latin count. So I'm not going to wear blue because their colors are red or something. And just a lot of crazy stuff that, thinking about it now, it's like how much, we had to sort of learn these signals and these signifiers for stuff that we weren't really involved with, but we definitely had friends and families that were involved with, and how to navigate that as a youth was hard, and makes up a lot of the the poems in the book is about that experience of being sort of looked upon as something when I really wasn't anything. And like I mentioned earlier in your class that I dressed a certain way, and we all hung out and acted a certain way at times. But it was never like, for me at least, there was never that moment of wanting to actually be down for that life, because I knew what it led to having one of my older cousins go through that experience. He was, shot and lived, thankfully. But I remember playing GI Joes with him when he was in this cast, and because he was 16 and I was like 12 or something. But yeah, I remember him being like housed up because he was shot and laying on the floor, but we were still hanging out and playing GI Joes because that's what we did as cousins and stuff. And so he would always tell me that there were a lot of friends of his that were dying around the time too, and he had experienced a lot of grief. And so I sort of knew that I wasn't going to be about that life. And I also wasn't like a fighter. I'm not a violent person, and that was like obviously a big part of it. Whereas the smoking weed or partying was a different element of it too, and I might have gotten involved in that a bit, but that was like that's just like coming of age type shit, or at least that's how I felt. So yeah, I mean, I guess we eventually moved out of the neighborhood like my senior year of high school, and moved to Berwyn, which is west of Cicero, and that was a different change, because the gang activity had reached a boiling point in our block specifically. And there was a shooting once we moved out of our neighborhood where a boy was shot, and he thankfully lived, but they ended up then Cicero started instituting like a zero tolerance policy, and then really cracked down on gangs for whatever that meant. Probably just locking up a bunch of young boys or putting them in juvenile, unfortunately. Just because they had, they were sort of lost and wayward a bit, and looking looking for a sense of community, but also looking for a sense of power too. I think that's part of the allure of being a gang, and empowered through violence.
Absolutely. On that note, maybe you wouldn't mind reading "This Never Happened," just to kind of get a sense of what you were just talking about as it manifests in a poem. I think.
Yeah, for sure. This never happened. You and your boys walk home from school and cut down the alley behind the varnish factory at the end of your block. 4 sophomores who ain't soft, looking hard in hairnets and starter jackets. The cool you exude so heavy, it drags your extra baggy black dickies halfway off your ass, even with a belt on. A banger in a blue Buick drives by and flashes the crown with his left hand. You throw it up right back at him because you're a wannabe, a gonna be, got brothers and cousins who were born to be kings. When he stops the car and calls you over to the driver's side door, you move like your kin, long lost and now found again. But the reunion ends when he pulls the gun out and presses it to your neck. The 22's cold steel kills the feeling of family, and your boys look on spooked, one ready to run, the other searching for a rock or bottle to throw. He asks who you ride with, what gang you and your boys ran, and when you tell him none, I ain't shit, we ain't shit, and are about to shit your pants because of the pistol and his black leather sleeve still gripping your neck, you remember the leather coat you asked your mom to get you for Christmas like the boys at school. Now you feel the fool, tricked by a 2-6 throwing up the crown with the wrong hand to check what set you claim. And because he's an OG and sees you're nothing but a shorty, scared and shivering in his arms, he warns you and your boys not to bang, not to hang on the corner, because if he ever saw you, he'd shoot you. Then he lets you loose and drives off slow like a cop who busts you for driving over the speed limit. Your boys crowd you like you've fallen from the sky, and you tell them you all right. Frightened, but forget him. Fuck him. But don't tell your brothers. Pretend like this never happened. Yeah, so I mean, that was obviously born of a real life incident and moment, and just walking home from school, and just having some dude flash us the sign, and I think, yeah, it was all because my friend flashed it back, thinking that he was, thinking he was a king, and he, his family members were kings at the time, and so it was like a salute, say what's up, and then just turned pretty quick, and I was definitely a shook moment, but thankfully no one got hurt and let us go, but it was just like. And it was just telling us not to tell his brothers about it. And it was like a strange thing. Is like, why? I wonder why not. Like, why he wouldn't want us to get that information. I guess they didn't want to create some more violence or war possibly with this gangbanger, probably. But so stuff like that, has happened throughout my life and has definitely shaped who I am and informed my writing in many ways.
Absolutely. So I guess another sort of incident or encounter that you have is on the train, right, in the L. And this is in Blue Line Incident I'm thinking of specifically. I'm wondering if you could talk about that poem, Blue Line Incident, and also why you decided to start the collection with Blue Line Incident.
Yeah. Should I read? Would you like me to read?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Blue Line Incident. He was just some coked out, crazed king with crooked teeth and a teardrop forever falling, baiting from his left eye, peddling crack to passengers or crackheads passing as passengers on a train chugging from Chicago to Cicero, from the loop through K-Town, Kedzie, Costner, Kildare. I was just a brown boy in a brown shirt, head shaven with fuzz on my chin, staring at treetops and rooftops, seated in a pair of beige shorts, a badge of possibility. A bunny let loose from 26th Street, hopping my way home, hoping not to get shot, stop after stop. But a banger I wasn't, and he wasn't buying it, sat across the aisle from me. Do you smoke crack? Hey, who you ride with? Are you a D? Let me see. Throw it down then. I hesitate, then fork 3 fingers down, then boast about my block, a recent branch in the king's growing tree. The boys of 15th and 51st, I say, they're my boys, my friends. I was fishing for a lifesaver and he hooked him in and had him say goodbye like we was boys and shit, when really I should have gutted that fuck with the tip of my blue ballpoint. So the genesis of that poem actually began, and that incident happened when I was taking a poetry workshop course at Columbia College Chicago. So I took one after my junior year of high school. They had this high school summer institute program that you could take, photography class there. I had a friend who took a video class at the time, and I was taking a poetry course. And I just had this encounter with this dude. It was actually 2 separate encounters. This one that I documented and read about was on a packed train, and he started questioning me, and I had to go through the whole role of like throwing down whatever sign, and then at the end of it he was like trying to be my boy and dap me up, and so I was like, all right, whatever. But then like not even like a week or 2 later, this guy again is there, and I was sitting by myself on the train on one end. There's somebody else by themselves, listening to headphones or whatever, and then this guy comes in the train, and he's got this look, because he's got this look about him. He's got tattoos on his face, and he's looks like he's fucked up again, and so he's talking to the dude over there for a while, and then he comes sit by me, and he's just like, again, he's like, hey, who you are? What are you? I'm like, and I recognize him, and he doesn't recognize me, but I'm like. So I go through the time, and I was like, hey, you don't remember me, dude? I was like, we just sort of did this like a couple weeks ago. And he's like, no. And because he was like drunk or high. And then he was asking me for money, and I didn't really have any money. And then, he's like, I need money for my 40 or whatever. He wanted to get drunk. And I was like, oh. And then he's like, well, what if I were to search your pockets right now? Well, what would I find? It's like, well, all right. Well, then at that point I was like, all right. Well, I guess I got $1 to give you, and then thankfully that was like the end of it. He ended up like going to another car and probably harassing somebody there too. So those 2 moments like helped spawn this poem that eventually became Blue Line Incident. So like the next workshop class, I don't even know if we had a theme or whatever, but I ended up writing this one poem called Frustration: Off My Chest. And at the time I was writing these poems, there was like, I was using a lot of different fonts for every poem I submitted. They were all in different fonts. And this one I used it's like bold expression or whatever. It's like that, it's like the army font, the very bold. And it was full of just like curse words and just like, fuck you and your fucked up face, I think might have been the first line or something. And just going in on this guy and trying to just ventilate, my frustrations, my anger of having to constantly be questioned by this person. And I shared it with class, and, it was well received. But then I just sort of like left it for a while, and then I think I revisited it. I don't know how long ago I revisited it, but I mean, that happened in 1999. But the poem was published in 2006. So within that time frame, I had revised it and turned it into what's now like Blue Line Incident from that. And for those that are interested, there's a good magazine called Underbelly Magazine, and that's about the revision process, where a poet talks about a poem and shares a rough draft versus the newer draft. So that poem is included in there and talked about the origins of that story. But there's some other really good revisions and revised poems on that site.
Why don't you talk a little bit about your creative process off that note then? What's the relationship that you have with sort of workshops or sort of collective group work as far as revising your own work? And maybe what other methods do you kind of go through, strategies or whatnot, when it's time to, sort of get pen to paper and write, produce?
Yeah. Well, I obviously went to I got my BA in creative writing poetry at Columbia College Chicago, where we were using the workshop form, and um, but I really connected with a few of my classmates there, Dan Suarez and Ellie Hill and Kamiko Ostroshovich, and we formed like our own workshop outside of the workshop, just to like build off of our experience and the poems that we were writing. Actually, it might have been the summer. I think we continued on like having our own workshops, and I really thought it was really informative. Like it was a good group to share work with, and we gave each other obviously great feedback, and we even had some of our professors like join in, like Tony Trujillo and Ed Roberson, a former professor of art, great poet. He ended up like joining in on us and like hanging out, and that was really cool to have that element. It's like they're no longer like the master, now they're just like a colleague, contemporary, and it was really cool to see their work in progress as opposed to always us showing our work to them, right? And so I kept, for a while we kept on sharing work with each other after we graduated, and then that sort of dissipated for various reasons, because not many of them pursued like writing or continue to write it as much as I was doing. But right now I share work with a couple of other poets. Like this is poet Maya Marshall, who has a book coming out this coming fall or in the summer, and she's a really good reader and one of my first readers, someone I share poems with, and really great feedback. And I'm also part of this like book club. It's called Poets Table, where we each read, the same book of poems or whatever for the month, and we discuss the book of poems, and at the end of it we share work. And that's not even necessarily for like feedback purposes. It's just share work for sharing's sake, and I feel good about that. But like I said, the majority of my writing tends to be in the on weekend mornings. Saturday or Sunday mornings are a really good time for me to sort of work on and revisit poems that I jot down in my journal. I carry a journal with me everywhere, and tend to write down things as I feel inspired, and then go back and revisit on like moments like Saturday mornings or something like that when I'm sort of fresh and stuff.
Do you remember the first poem you published?
I think, yeah. I mean, if it was in high school, yeah.
High school.
Yeah.
So you've been publishing poetry since high school?
Yeah. So in high school, at Morton East, there was a literary magazine. Maybe it's still there, called Parchment, and I was one of the editors there eventually. And I think it was right after that, my senior year of high school, I ended up becoming like an editor there. And but before I was an editor, I was, submitted some poems, some very terrible love poems, which they ended up accepting and publishing because, that's all high school, I think. But yeah, so like I feel like I don't remember the title of, one of the poems I had published in there. Maybe One Night Stand. Again, it might have been about like my father, a poem about my absent father. But yeah, later on, in senior year of high school, I was working with the magazine and get to see what other people were writing. And, we're talking about it a little, or mentioned it with your class that you read Erica Sanchez's book. So Erica Sanchez was, went to the same high school. She is 2 years younger than me. And I remember reading her work in the journals and accepting her poems, which were kind of strange and dark. Really good though, original stuff, as opposed to the crap I was producing. But I remember we wanted to publish one of her poems, but we couldn't because like the final lines of hers were touching cunts, I think is what it was. And it was like too risque for our journal to publish. And I remember like years later, she would jokingly say to me, "It's like, I'll never forgive you for not publishing that poem." But I really love the process of, reading other people's work and sort of getting exposed to the writing via that way, and seeing what my contemporaries are writing. And so I ended up pursuing some work. In the bio you read, obviously you mentioned Rhino, which up until last year I actually was just associate editor or editor there. I stepped down for my role last year. from it, but it was really great for 10 or 11 years. I was a part of the process of putting together an annual journal in addition to like readings and workshops that we had. I mean, it's a team effort to get that journal and the community going. But right now, I'm currently doing some work for Haymarket Poetry, the Haymarket Poetry Project, and I'm reading manuscripts and offering some advice for maybe what to publish there. And I'm really grateful to be a part of it. Jose Olivares is a part of it. Susie Garcia, Maya Marshall, who I mentioned, Erica Foreman, another great Chicago-based poet. We're sort of like the advisory board right now and helping to hopefully put out some good poetry in the next couple of years.
Was there a moment you said, I have to write poetry, I want to publish poetry, I want to dedicate myself to the office of poetry? When does that come about, and what is the sort of the reasons you decide to enter this occupation?
Yeah, I mean, I think really enjoying the experience of being a part of the literary magazine in high school helped inform, my decision to pursue writing. Like I always knew, I mean, since I was in middle school, that I wanted to pursue the life of a writer in some ways. And maybe initially I thought like maybe fiction would be the way to do it because I was writing a lot of stories at the time. But then in high school, I switched to poetry and decided to pursue that. Columbia College, Chicago at the time offered the only undergrad degree for poetry, whereas normally you got to get the MFA for it. But they had it, and I was like, well, my brother was going there at the time, and I was like, it'd be cool to just get this out of the way, or not get it out of the way, but just to pursue it there and then see what comes of it. And I mean, so I guess early on I knew that I wanted to pursue this life of a writer, not necessarily knowing what it would entail. Obviously publishing is a part of it, but it's not the end all be all of it. I think obviously the point for me, I mean, it's just the act of writing itself is really what matters. I saw there's some tweet going around recently that's saying that like one of the things that's not taught about being a writer is that you have to care, and you have to care about, and so much of it is like boring, like caring about a comma here or removing a comma there, and like caring about your own work and rereading it. And the tweet was like, I mean, I'm summarizing badly here probably, but saying that caring can be boring, but it still matters. And I think that's something that I think I take to heart. I do care about my work, and I do care about the writing. Obviously, being published is one of the gifts that it can offer you. But it's like I said, it's not the end all be all. And I mean, so far it's been working out. I graduated with a degree in poetry, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to pursue with it. Like I was going to maybe do some editing work, and applied for different jobs and didn't end up getting it. But there was a position open at the library, and I really loved working and being surrounded by books. So I've been there ever since, pretty much, and that's definitely helped to shape me as a writer, just to have all these different resources and just to get access, first dibs on certain books that I would love to read and save some money on too, because you're not spending all the money on buying the books. So that helps. I'm a big believer in libraries and borrowing books from the library. And it's been allowed me time to sort of work on my own writing. My job is pretty good about giving me like just, when I did that residency, I didn't have a month long worth of vacation time, but they gave me 2 extra weeks of like professional development time, which is really very generous of them. I still used 2 weeks of vacation, but just to have that sort of support there at the institution was really helpful and beneficial.
Can you talk a little bit about how reading other poets, other writers, how that has influenced you, especially as somebody again who works in the library, right? What's your sense of how you use reading other poets for yourself, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the process too, is reading. The process of writing, I mean, is reading. And I read a lot. I read a variety of work, not just poets. I read a lot of fiction. I I recently read a great fiction novel called The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. And I think it won like the National Book Award a couple years ago, but it was a really great book. And I feel like because I started out as like a fiction writer, I guess, so I still have that love and affinity for it, and still sometimes think about like maybe switching gears for a bit and trying to do some like fiction or short stories or stuff. But it's, for right now, for me, it's enough to just sort of indulge in it and read it. But in terms of reading other poets, I definitely think that has helped me as a writer and develop as a poet. Some of the poems in the book are after poets, like obviously the Nicanor Parra. There's a poem that's after Mary Jo Bang in one of her books. And so I think that's a key part to development of any writer is sort of reading a text that you like and then trying to imitate it and seeing what styles you can sort of riff off of and maybe claim as your own and try to meld who you are as a writer with all these different other writers to draw from, or artists, not even just necessarily writers, but right, you could draw off different artists, but I'm more of just the page person.
Are there any other poems that you might want to read? We have a couple, maybe 6-7 more minutes. Is there another poem you would like us to come away with from your collection?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll read. I'll read a couple of these poems from the book called "They're About My Brother and My Family," I guess. This one's called "Bookmark," found in the works of Walt Whitman. I guess both of these are about substance abuse. So, "Bookmark," found in the works of Walt Whitman. As usual, my brother and I are glass-eyed and smiles, talking about our desire to stop smoking when I pulled the book off its shelf. I brushed some dust off Whitman's hat and beard like ash, fingered through pages, and find a bookmark courtesy of the American Cancer Society. How appropriate, I say when I give it to him. He sees the picture of a girl's face with cheeks round as apples, eyes dark as tar, looking for a cure for cancer. The caption under her face reads, "Best tip, don't start." He laughs, accidentally loses his hit, flips the bookmark over and reads that smoking kills more people every year than car crashes, AIDS, and murders combined. Shit, if that ain't a wake-up call, he says, as he tightly packs another bowl, takes a deep puff, and exhales like ancient dragon's last breath. And sort of the poem that follows it in the book is a case of MGDs. I drank 4 MGDs Monday night because I smoked all my weed last weekend. Theo Jesse likes MGD any day, time of week. Says initials mean Mexican getting drunk. He drinks with Big Manny, who likes Bud, some mornings over their huevos con nopales y salsa. Theo attends AA on Sundays just to cook pans of pancakes and sausages for sober sides, then splits a sixer with Big Manny in return for the leftovers brought over. Mom doesn't mind the food, just a drink of husband, brother, nephew, sons. Like Grandpa's picture framed and displayed in the living room. He sitting on the sofa, a Pabst Blue Ribbon in his brown hands.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really like, there's something about, well, both the poems I think give a lot to talk about. But I guess why did you choose to read these 2 poems?
I'm not sure. I think it's more of they're poems I don't normally share, I guess, with the public, or I haven't shared them like in a public setting and lately or in a while really. They're just not poems I sort of seek out, and I thought it'd be a good opportunity to share them here and hear them aloud again. And I mean, I think a lot about the role that addiction plays in our family, and how it's like this generational things. It seems. I mean, we suffer from alcoholism amongst other substance abuses, and so I try to write about it as best I can, and try to see that we're all sort of struggling, and I think it's I don't know. I think it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and a lot of the books is sort of about that. There are moments that talk about the substance abuse and stuff. So I just thought it would be good to sort of share these poems that I don't normally share with in other settings, I guess.
Definitely, for sure. What about the differences in form, though? Because they are, I mean, both about, as you said, sort of different forms of substance abuse. But I'm interested, though, in one, the subject is you and your brother, right? And the structure is sort of a big block of text. And then for case of MGDs, we have different male figures in your life, right? Sort of a male sociality there around drinking, especially. So what kind of went into choosing to structure, to format those poems differently, even though, again, both are about substance abuse?
Yeah, I think at least with the case of MGD's poems, I was thinking about the way it's formed, just like terse sets, but they're each line is indented, and so I thought the form could sort of work to mimic the sort of pass down the passing down of the substance abuse or the addiction that we struggle with, or that's in our genetics. And I thought that was a good way to sort of use it with that form. The bookmark found in the works of Walt Whitman poem, I thought it was just a little block text. I mean, there's nothing too much with it. It felt like it just felt natural to go with that form. I would try to say it's like in the form or in the vein of Whitman, but it's not really, because his work tends to be not in this type of form. But it was just like a moment that I wanted to capture, and having this and they felt good to sort of sit next to each other too. But then the book, they're both about these looks at different substance abuses, sort of back to back, and but they're in different forms, and I thought that'd be a good sort of break within the book.
Absolutely. All right. Well, any last things you would like us to know? Both for readers and for people who are aspiring poets as well.
Well, I think for writers, I think the most important thing is to read, and to read voraciously, to read widely. And that knowing that the writing is not going to always be it's not always going to be happening, even when you want it. I was struggling with writing myself, within the past 2 years. The past few months have been good in terms of my writing. I've been producing more and writing regularly, whereas I think maybe the early stages of the pandemic, even before that, I wasn't writing as much. And I thought, I was struggling, because I was like, here we all, we're sitting at home having this time to sort of not go outside, basically, and just sit with ourselves. And I know some writers did thrive in that environment. I unfortunately was not, but I also have learned to accept that it's okay that these dry spells or these moments of silence are necessary, because it's you're just sort of building. I was always thinking about writing. I was still reading, and so it was just sort of marinating on stuff that eventually came out and has been coming out in the works that I've been writing lately, some of which I'll share later tonight at the reading. But just don't beat yourself up if you're struggling with the writing, and know that it'll come when it's necessary and when it matters.
Great. Well, on behalf of Letras Latinas and ILS, I'd like to thank you for being here, and we look forward to your evening reading as well tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you.